Hey, welcome everyone to the webinar on ISO 14065's relationship to ISO IEC 17029. I will be your presenter and facilitator for this session today. My name is Emma Dutton. Just a few logistics before we get started today. All attendees do come in muted and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. This just helps us cut down on background noise. If you have questions, you can enter your questions into the Q&A box. Plan time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have. So just a little bit about myself. As mentioned, my name is Emma. I am an instructional designer and an instructor for ANAB. I have designed and delivered training courses on a number of conformity assessment topics, primarily to the forensic community, since 2013. But have branched out a bit into other areas for curriculum development and instruction, such as greenhouse gas verification and validation, general analytical method validation and verification, and measurement uncertainty. So prior to joining ANAB, I spent more than 11 years as a quality manager in a forensic laboratory, and my portfolio also includes about 12 years of conducting research in pharmaceuticals and biotechnology industries, as well as teaching biology as an adjunct professor at a couple of local universities. So enough about myself. Let's get into these webinar objectives. The objectives for today is to provide you with a brief overview of ISO 14065 and ISO IEC 17029. We want to understand the structure and the content of these two documents so that you can gain an understanding of the relationship between these two documents. I'll point out a few of the key differences and similarities between these two requirement documents. So hopefully in the end, you'll learn about both and how they are both used for greenhouse gas validation and/or verification of claims. So ISO 14065 and ISO IEC 17029. Let's start with a brief introduction and an overview of the structure and content of these two documents. So ISO IEC 17029 is titled Conformity Assessment, General Principles and Requirements for Validation and Verification Bodies. It was prepared by CASCO, or the ISO CASCO Committee. CASCO is the Committee on Conformity Assessment, and it is the committee that has developed all of the 17,000 series of documents related to conformity assessment. These documents are the documents that are used for conformity assessment bodies, such as testing and calibration laboratories, inspection bodies, or validation and verification bodies, and really to develop a management system to be able to demonstrate that they are in conformance to a set of requirements. Additionally, accreditation bodies, or ABs, use these documents to assess those conformity assessment bodies for accreditation purposes or recognition of their competence to perform the tasks or activities that are listed on that scope document. So ISO IEC was first published as a standard, and this is ISO IEC 17029, was first published as a standard requirement document in 2019. So it's fairly new on the scene as a conformity assessment document. ISO 14065, titled General Principles and Requirements for Bodies Validating and Verifying Environmental Information, was prepared by the ISO Technical Committee 207, and this was first published in 2007, so a number of years prior to 17029. Since then, this document has gone through two revisions, one in 2013 and the most recent in 2020. The current version has been aligned with the requirements of ISO IEC 17029, and the scope has been expanded to include bodies performing validation, verification, and agreed upon procedures in all areas of environmental information, not just greenhouse gases. Both documents contain general principles and requirements for validation and verification bodies, with ISO 14065 having requirements that are specific to environmental information. So let's dig into these documents a little bit more. In the introduction, of these two documents, it gives a little more specifics regarding the intent of the use of these documents. As mentioned, both documents have requirements for validation and verification of claims. However, ISO 14065 is a sector-specific document which references 17029 and includes specific requirements for validation and verification of environmental information. It is used to ensure environmental information is accurate and reliable. It gives assurance on statements of historical information, such as verification, and to validate forecasted information to ensure it is based on reasonable assumptions and methods. Overall, 14065 provides program owners, regulators, and accreditation bodies with a basis for assessing and recognizing the competence of validation and verification bodies. 17029 states principles and requirements for validation and verification as well, but for conformity assessment, for the confirmation of reliability of information declared in claims. So when using this document for conformity assessment activities, the reliability of the information declared in the claim is confirmed, and a decision is made regarding the confirmation of that claim. That is it in conformance, or is there non-conformance to the requirement? Additionally, since the requirements are generic and applicable to all types of validations and verifications, when using 17029, a program for the particular type of validation or verification is needed. In the end, this really does give the same kind of confidence to the stakeholders and the parties that are interested in that claim. As a note, for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to refer to these two documents by the number only, 14065 or 17029. So let's look at the structure. Really, the structure and how the requirements are laid out are the same in both of these documents, going from the scope all the way to the management system requirements. There are a few key differences and similarities in content, however, and this will be presented in the next few slides. The annexes are different. So in 17029, there are 3 annexes that deal specifically with the elements of verification and validation, terms and concepts defined in 17029, and an illustration of a validation verification application, which we'll see in just a few minutes. 14065 gives more specifics to verification and validation of environmental information. And I'll reference some of these annexes as we start looking at some of the requirements, and you'll see where these come into play. So we start with the scope. Really, the scope of these two documents is different, and some of this difference I've already mentioned. So Section 1 describes the scope of the standards, and 17029 contains the general principles and requirements for competence, consistent operation, and impartiality of bodies performing validation and verification as conformity assessment activities. It is a generic document. It does apply to validations and verification bodies in any sector to provide confirmation of validation or verification claims. 14065, as mentioned, is also used by bodies performing validation and verification, but specifically for environmental information. Environmental information statements are claims. It is basically sector-specific requirements in addition to the requirements that are in 17029. For both documents, the validation verification activity can be performed as a first or second or third party activity and can be for validation only, verification only, or both. Keep in mind, as mentioned, 17029 can be the basis for accreditation, and a primary difference in 14065, doing validations or verifications, it can be performed on agreed upon procedures. And we'll talk a little more about this in the next few slides. So really the relationship between ISO 14065 and 17029 is that both documents can be used for validation and verification of claims. 17029, however, is specific for conformity assessment activities and does require a sector-specific program. 14065 can be used as a sector-specific program requirement in conjunction with 17029 for conformity assessment. But 14065 can also be used by itself, and it really is aligned with and references requirements in 17029. So while there are some differences in the scope, there are a lot of similarities in the requirements, as we will see in a few minutes. So we've talked a lot about these two documents and that they both can be used for either validation or verification, or both. But really, what is the difference between validation and verification? So here are the definitions from both 17029 and 14065. For validation, it is the confirmation of a claim through the provision of objective evidence that the requirements for a specific intended future use or application have been fulfilled. 14065 has a very similar definition. It's the process to evaluate the reasonableness of the assumptions, limitations, and methods that support a statement, that is the claim, about the outcome of future activities. A verification, on the other hand, is the confirmation of a claim through the provision of objective evidence that specified requirements have been fulfilled. Or, from 14064, it's the process for evaluating a claim of historical data and information to determine if the statement is materially correct and conforms to criteria. The primary difference is, again, that for 17029, it is a conformity assessment activity that is giving you confirmation that you're in conformance with the requirements. So a little illustration. And this illustration can be found in the Annex C of 17029. So for verification, it focuses on actual results achieved. That is, the data is already there. You have the data to evaluate. It has already happened. For example, you have the amount of greenhouse gas emissions during a given period of time that you can use that data and actually do the calculations and the estimations on the amount of emissions that were created during that period of time, or the amount of emission reductions that occurred during a period of time. Or maybe you're looking at the conformance with the standard or program during a period of time. So the event has already happened. It's in the past. It's historical information. And when you're doing that verification, you're taking that data that's already been generated, and you're evaluating that data to see if it supports the claim that has been provided by the client. And it does provide a level of assurance. For validation, however, it involves assessing the reasonableness of the assumptions and limitations and methods that support a claim about the outcome of future activities or performance. So this is something that is going to happen in the future. To almost like make predictions. You still have data to evaluate to support the claim. However, you're making those predictions on the occurrence of the activity that's going to happen. In this case, for example, it could be we've made a claim and there's an expected amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the future period of time that's going to happen, and you evaluate based on that information that you have if this is reasonable assumption with the limitations of the methods that have been used to make that prediction. So when you're looking at a verification, it's really looking at historical data, and a validation is looking at a claim that could predict the outcome of a future occurrence. And they're both based on that time frame. So we've talked a lot about claims, and really haven't given a definition of a claim. So in this sense, a claim is the information declared by the client. For 17029, this is the object of the conformity assessment of the validation or verification. The claim can represent a situation at a single point in time or can cover a period of time. Additionally, the claim should be clearly identifiable and capable of consistent evaluation and measurement against specific requirements. Keep in mind that a claim can be provided in various forms, such as a report, a statement, a declaration, a project plan, or even consolidated data. And you can see the definition of a claim here stated between 17029 and 14065 are very similar. The one difference between the two is that for 17029, it is the object of conformity assessment, and the environmental information statement that is referred to here in this definition, note 4 indicates that this is the term that is similar to claim. So claims for 17029 and for 14065 will be different, as any claim under 14065 will be regarding environmental information, whereas 17029 can be claims from a broad range of industries or sectors. We look at section 2, the normative references. They're very similar between the two documents, with 17029 stating that 17,000 is one of the normative references. And 14065 states the same thing. 17,000 is one of the normative references, as well as 17029. Thus, any of the information in either one of those documents is applicable to 14065. And then 14065 has some additional references that are also applicable to validations and verifications of environmental information. And those documents are listed here. Section 3 lays out the terms and definitions for these two documents. And again, a lot of similarities between the terms that they use. And the one thing that is overarching is that 14065 incorporates all of those terms and definitions from 17029 plus 17,000, plus has 40 additional terms that are related to environmental information, to personnel and organization, and to validation and verification. So it has more terms and definitions that it brings into consideration in the 14065 document. But there are many terms and definitions that are the same between the two documents, and those are listed here. We've already encountered a few of these terms, such as claim and validation and verification. Now let's get into these two documents and really pick apart some of the key differences and similarities. I'm going to show you some of the requirements. I've laid them out in table format. And in this table format, you should be able to differentiate between 17029 and 14065 and see where there are differences and similarities in the requirements for validation and verification. When we look at these two documents, keep in mind that 14065 references 17029 requirements right in its document as an ISO IEC 17029 2019 XY shall be followed. And you can see that here in this example. In addition, if there are additional elements or notes, those would be provided following the requirement. And if there's a new clause that 14065 adds, it will give it the next number clause in that list. So you can see here it's stating under 4.1, ISO IEC 17029 shall be followed, and then it gives an additional note. 4.4 is a new requirement, and that just follows the next sequence numbered. So here's it in table format. So section 4. 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 are identical. 14065 just as follows 17029. There are two additional requirements, 4.4 and 4.5. 4.4 is about conservativeness, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Be conservative in the approach, and if you have comparable alternatives assessed, give preference to the one that's more conservative, or be cautiously moderate. 4.5 is all about professional skepticism. This requirement is really providing a definition of professional skepticism. That is, it is an attitude based on recognition of potential circumstances that can cause material misstatements. That is, if you have the attitude, you actually need to have the attitude that enhances the auditor's ability to identify and respond to conditions that may indicate possible misstatements. So you need to have a questioning mind, and you need to perform a critical assessment of the objective evidence. Bottom line, we always go in as assessors with that trust but verify attitude, and we use good judgment when we're evaluating the claim. Section 5 are the general requirements. 14065 does provide a few additional elements to the 17029 requirements that are fairly straightforward. To show conformance to 5.1, being the legal entity, 14065 says the verification or validation body must have a documented description of the legal status. And this must include, if applicable, the names of the owners or the names of the persons who control that organization. 5.2 goes on to give an additional element and makes it clear that the validation and verification body is responsible for the activities that it performs in agreed upon procedure engagements and for the reports of factual findings that it issues as the result of the application of the procedures. So this is something that's new to 14065 or different between 14065 and 17029, is that you can do this verification of agreed upon procedures and submit the results or the factual findings. So this is something that is not done if you do a verification or validation following 17029. We'll talk a little more about agreed upon procedures a bit later. Additionally, the body, that is the verification validation body, shall ensure that impartiality is being achieved. So section 6, it's identical between the two. There's nothing that is different. So everything under the structure requirements is the same between 17029 and 14065. Section 7 are the resource requirements. In this section, there are additional notes or requirements to the existing 17029 clauses. So 14065 brings in these additional elements and really had 6 new requirements. So a lot more to consider when doing that validation or verification with that 14065 document for environmental information. One thing to note is that 7.3.2 lays out the requirements for the competency of personnel for each function in that validation and verification process. In 14065, there are several additional requirements as well as a reference to additional requirements and competencies that are given in Annexes D, E, and F, which shall be followed as applicable. So here are the annexes that come into play that are in that 14065 document that bring in those additional requirements. I'm going to leave it to you to read through these requirements on your own. And as a cautionary note, when you're reading and comparing these requirements, to get a complete understanding of the requirements, please be sure to read the full requirements as stated in 17029 and 14065. I have them paraphrased here, and really to get that best understanding, we need to read them in their text. Section 7 goes on with additional resource requirements. And as mentioned in the previous slide, these are the new clauses in 14065, 7.34 through 7.39. These requirements all focus on the verification validation team and cover topics from establishing competent teams to providing appropriate management and support services, to the team having the ability to apply detailed knowledge and sufficient technical expertise to evaluate activities and technologies, and have the data and information auditing experience to evaluate the environmental information statement or claim. Additionally, the team shall be able to communicate effectively. There is one additional requirement in 7.39 that says the team leader needs to have these specific elements, A through C, for the team leader. The outsourcing requirement is the same between the two documents, but there is a note that provides additional clarification in 14065 that says engagement activities refer to the process by which an agreement between the client and the body is conducted, or concluded, rather. So the next section, Section 8. Section 8 is identical between the two. There's nothing added in 14065. It just says follow 17029. This is the validation and verification program. There are two notes that provide clarification regarding the validation verification program. It says note 1 really provides a definition. Validation verification program is a set of rules, procedures, and management for carrying out a validation verification activity in the specific section. Note 2 points to Annex A, which specifies the elements that a program can include. So remember, ISO 14065 can be included as part of the validation verification program for validating, verifying environmental information if you're using it in conjunction with 17029 as a conformity assessment activity. So Section 1, process requirements. This is the longest section in both 17029 and 14065. And this goes to reason, because this is the section that lays out the requirements for performing a validation or verification. Both 17029 and 14065 follow the same steps. There's the pre-engagement, the engagement, the planning, the validation, verification, execution, review, decision, and issue of the validation verification statement. The additional steps do include what to do with facts discovered after the issue of the validation verification statement and how to handle appeals, complaints, and records. The majority of the requirements in clause 9.1 through 9.5 are the same between the two documents. 14065 does add a few additional elements to 17029 clauses and one new clause in 9.4.5, which gives requirements for handling amendments to the validation verification plan and evidence gathering plan. Again, I'll let you read through these in their entirety. I've laid them out here. I'm giving some indication on what clauses have additional elements versus what requirements are new clauses that have been added to 14065. Continuing with Section 9, process requirements. There are additional elements to the 17029 requirements in 14065 for clauses 962, 964, and 965, as I have detailed out here. These additional elements are regarding how the review will be carried out, what the review shall confirm, and when the review may be started. For 9.6.3, there is an added note for clarifying what is considered a significant finding. So significant findings are misstatements and nonconformities identified by the validation verification team that could affect the opinion. Clause 9.6.6 is an additional requirement in 14065. This indicates that the review shall be completed before the final opinion or the report of factual finding for an agreed upon procedure is issued. And then 9.7 is all about decisions and issues of the verification validation statement. There are additional elements to 17029 requirements in that 14065 document. From 9712 to 9714, these requirements detail when a claim can be confirmed, that the validation verification body gets to decide whether or not to confirm an environmental information statement or that claim, using agreed upon procedures in a mixed engagement, and that the decision shall be made by persons who have not been involved in validation verification planning. So give that level of independence in stating that claim or that opinion. Furthermore, there are 5 additional clauses in 14065 that detail requirements regarding issuing of opinions. And lastly, 14065 has additional requirements for 9.7.2 regarding what the opinion must contain if the information statement includes a mixture of hypothetical, projected, and/or historical information. Again, I'm going to let you peruse through these requirements so you can read them and compare them in their entirety. The last few elements or clauses of Section 9 are the same, from facts discovered after the issue of validation verification statement to handling appeals and complaints and records. They're identical. For Section 10, these are the information requirements. The first additional element in 14065 under 10.1 specifies that publicly provided information includes any requirements regarding the use of the body's opinion in its entirety and makes a reference to Annex B in 14065. So this reference to validate verified statements and use of the marks. So you have to go to Annex B and look at the elements that are laid out there in that annex to determine what is required if that publicly provided information is included. 14065 then goes on to state in 10.2.3 that the validation verification team shall provide a detailed description of the validation verification process. And it provides a note that the description of the process includes how the body considers previous results. So adding a little more clarification there. 10.3.2 in 14065 has additional elements to 17029 regarding the agreement, where the agreement requires that the client shall not use the environmental information statement, the opinion, the report, marks, logos, or labels in a manner that could mislead intended users or impair the reputation of the validation verification. And lastly, 14065 has an additional requirement, 10.3.3, that the agreement shall require the client to ensure opinions and reports made public by the client are communicated in their entirety. Confidentiality is identical between the two documents. I think you're getting a sense now between these two documents that all of the requirements that are listed in 17029 are incorporated into 14065. And it's in 14065 where it's specific to environmental information, where it flushes out some nuances and some specifics for how to do those verifications and validations. So we see this trend all the way through. The last section in these documents, other than the annexes, outlines the management system requirements and is fairly similar between 17029 and 14065. 17029 states that the management review and the internal audit shall be conducted at planned intervals. However, 14065 elevates this requirement to be more stringent and states to do the review and the audit, you need to do it at least once a year. And this is not to exceed 15 months between the review or the audit. All the other requirements in section 11 are the same between the two documents. So in summary, we've seen this trend between these two documents where 14065 incorporates additional elements or clauses to lay out in more specific details the requirements for validation and verification of environmental information. I hope this brief overview and the comparison between these two documents has provided you with some information to see how these two validation verification standard documents can be used, and gives you some of the similarities and differences between the two. Primarily, 17029 and 14065 both contain general principles and requirements. 17029 is for the competence, consistent operation, and impartiality of bodies performing validations and verifications. 17029 is used for conformity assessment activities. That is, it can be the basis for accreditation, and it applies to a broad sector. So it's more general in nature. Because of that, it does require the use of a program. (14065) contains the same general principles and requirements for bodies performing validation and verification, and additional principles and requirements for environmental information specifically. It can be used in conjunction with 17029, and as you've seen, it references and aligns with the 17029 requirements. That is, it's incorporated all of the 17029 requirements. However, 14065 is to be used specifically to conform or to conduct verifications and validations of environmental information, and as such does contain additional sector-specific requirements. A verification validation body can use 14065 also for an agreed-upon procedures engagement. Additionally, ISO 14065 can be used in conjunction with 17029, as previously mentioned, as the program to specify some of the program requirements for that environmental information. In the end, both documents can be used either individually or together for validation verification, to provide a level of assurance to the claim, to give assurance to the stakeholders and interested parties about that claim. So this brings us to the end of this webinar on 17029 and 14065. I do want to give you a little more information, just so you know. We are developing a training course titled Understanding ISO IEC 17029 and ISO 14065 for validating and verifying environmental information that will go into additional details and specific steps of performing validation and verification of environmental information. We're planning to have this completed by the beginning of 2023. Let's visit the ANAB website, the training site, to look for this new course posting. I do want to tell you a little more about some additional resources that we have before we get to those questions that have come in. So we have some additional resources that include webcasts, webinars, blogs, and of course our training. Webcasts are free. These are pre-recorded 5 to 20-minute long segments or videos that provide additional information on accreditation and standard requirements. We also have these webinars that we do on a monthly basis that provide informational sessions on a variety of topics. And if you didn't know, we also have an ANAB blog page, which has a wealth of information related to risks, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. And many of these blogs also get posted on the LinkedIn site. We also offer live, online, in-person, and self-paced training courses in many areas, including internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, and risk analysis. All of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.org. Now let's get to the fun part, your questions. So I do have a few questions that have come in. We do have a few minutes left for questions. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to type those in the Q&A pod or the Q&A panel. So one of the first questions that came in is that you mentioned first, second, and third party validations verifications. Could you please explain the difference between these three things? So what's the difference between a first, second, and third party verification validation? If you do a first party validation, this is where the verification validation body is an internal body of the organization. So it's an internal verification or validation. It's an entity within that organization itself. Second party verification or validations is where the verification and validation body has a user interest in that claim. And third party validations are completely independent. That the verification validation body is independent of the person or the organization that provides the claim, and there's no user interest in the claim. And an example of that would be like an accrediting body, which is an independent external entity from the organization that provides the claim, and there's no user interest in that claim. So another question that has been posted is regarding agreed upon procedures. This for 14065, you mentioned performing a verification on agreed upon procedures, like having an agreed upon procedures engagement. What exactly is that? What's agreed upon procedures? So agreed upon procedures, or how they abbreviated AUP, it's a type of engagement that reports results only. And this is really a verification activity. So there has to be that historical data for the verification to occur. In this case, it's only reporting on the results or the facts. It doesn't provide an opinion, and it doesn't give any kind of assurance. So it's just reporting on the results. Keep in mind that an engagement is an agreement between the verification validation body and its client with the terms to perform those services. It usually comes in the form of a contract. But the main thing here, if you're doing an agreed upon procedures engagement, you're not providing an opinion or a declaration to the intended user that provides any level of assurance that the claim is materially correct. It's only reporting on the results. And then the last question that I have is regarding the mention of professional skepticism. And if I could expand a little more on what professional skepticism is all about. I'm going to direct you to Annex A of 14066. This provides information on professional skepticism and really lays it out fairly well on what is professional skepticism. It really is an attitude of trust but verify. So going in as an assessor or as the person performing the validation verification, you have to trust what they're saying in the claim, but you have to verify that information. So we have to collect sufficient objective evidence to be able to evaluate that objective evidence to make an opinion on the reasonableness of that claim and give some level of assurance. So that if you trust what they're telling you, but collect that objective evidence to verify the claim, You have to consider that materiality of that claim, or the materiality going into that claim that will give you that level of assurance. You have to think about the risks that are involved, the quantity and quality of the available evidence that's there during the planning and the performing of that verification and validation, and then recognize that there may be circumstances that exist that could cause the subject matter information to be materially misstated. So we're really giving it that critical assessment, that critical evaluation of that objective evidence to make an opinion or to state our opinion that gives a level of assurance in that information. So we have to have that question in mind. We have to be alert to evidence that may contradict or be contradictory or bring into question the reliability of the documents or the information that we're reviewing. And see how that is all being represented in that claim. All right, are there any additional questions that I need? Looking at the chat as well as the Q&A pod. All right, so with that, that is all that I have for you for today. Here's some additional contact information. If you have any questions or anything about training that's coming up, or that is posted on our webpage, please don't hesitate to send an email to training@anab.org. And of course, for any additional information related to accreditation services, you can contact ANAB@anab.org. I want to thank you all very much for your attention and for your questions, and have a really great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.